Stay connected to your community and save. Just 99 cents a month gets you 3 months of unlimited access to Inform.com. Visit Inform.com/subscribe and get your first 3 months of news for only 99 cents a month.
Readers solve the mystery identity of the Fargo toddler who traveled via U.S. mail. It turns out that might have been one of the least interesting things about him. Hi, this is Tracy Briggs, and welcome to Back Then. Well, it's not often that you learn something about your parents long after they're gone. But that's not the case for Cecilia O'Keefe of Fargo. Her story starts with an email she sent to me a couple of weeks ago. It read, "My name is Cecilia Colby O'Keefe. I'm intrigued by your article about mailing children in today's lifestyle. Fred W. Colby is my father." The article O'Keefe is talking about was published on October 18th and detailed how some Americans took advantage of new postal regulations starting in 1913 by putting their children in the mail. Yeah, you heard that right. They would put their children in the mail and send them to places across town or across the country. Of course, it sounds way worse than it really was. Basically, it was just a way to save a little bit of money. Instead of having Junior take a train to visit Grandma or Grandpa in a neighboring town, they'd put a parcel post sticker on him and give him to the mailman, many of whom was well known by the parents themselves, and then that mailman would hand-deliver the child to the address that was on the parcel post sticker. So, not terrible. At least not as terrible as it sounds. Anyway, according to newspaper reports at the time, that is exactly what Mr. and Mrs. Fred Colby of Fargo did in 1915 when they mailed their toddler, Freddie, to see his grandparents in Valley City. At the end of my story, I wondered what happened to little Freddie. So I started by looking in the form's biographical index for anybody named Freddie Colby. I found one file for a man named Fred Colby who lived in Fargo, and that is O'Keefe's father. He was a successful lawyer and community leader from the 1940s until his death in the 1990s. But I wasn't entirely sure that he was the little Freddie Colby of postal fame. And his daughter, Cecilia O'Keefe, wasn't sure about that either. She wrote to me, "I have never heard of any story about my dad being mailed to visit, but it would not surprise me." Now, definite signs pointed that Freddie and Fred Colby were one and the same person, including their birth years and the fact that both had relatives living in Valley City. However, their parents' names did not match up. The grown-up Fred Colby, the attorney, his father's name was Earl, not Fred. His mother's name was Maud, but as was the case with newspapers as late as the 1980s, women were only referred to as Mrs. Husband's name. That still drives me completely batty. In fact, I wrote a story about this several years ago. So if you go to Inform.com and look on this story, there's a link to that story. It specifically talks about the sexist language used in want ads. For example, the want ad columns used to be help wanted man, help wanted woman. Sometimes the jobs would be exactly the same, and the salary was always more for the ad that was in the mail column. Okay, but I digress. Go check that out, though. It's pretty fun. So anyway, neither Cecilia nor I could say with 100% accuracy that Fred Colby, her dad, and that grown-up attorney was indeed the mailed toddler of 1915. But O'Keefe was a real sport. In fact, she dabbles in family history, so she wanted to find out. She contacted her dad's cousin, James Gloag, a writer and family historian from Glenwood, Minnesota, to see maybe if he might know any stories about that. At first, he said the story didn't ring a bell at all. But then he says a fuzzy memory came back to him about an amusing story his mother's mother once shared. This is what he wrote. This memory is of Grandma Cronin telling the story of how the mailman brought Fred out to the farm, and I think he even had the parcel post sticker on his shirt or his jacket front. I think he had come by train. Grandma was mainly laughing in the telling of the story, as I recall. There was a big splash in the paper showing Fred's arrival at the station, and Maud, for sure, and I think Grandma too, got quite a kick out of the publicity of it. You know, like, this would be Maud. Okay, that's super promising, right? Sounds like the same guy, but what about the wrong father's name in the paper? Well, O'Keefe and I deduced a couple of things. Freddie's father's name was not Fred, but his grandfather was named Fred. His grandmother was named Emma. The initial report I read was out of a paper in Sauk Rapids, Minnesota, and not Fargo or Valley City, where this incident happened. So, like that old sleepover game of telephone, some details, like the correct name of Freddie's parents, probably just got mixed up as the story was shared from town to town and paper to paper. I finished the story by saying if Fred Colby, the successful Fargo attorney, was indeed the male toddler, it appeared he was none the worse for wear after his time as a parcel package. After confirming his identity, talking to O'Keefe, and digging a little deeper, it's abundantly clear getting mailed as a toddler was just the start of a pretty interesting life. You see, years after his 15 minutes of fame as the male toddler, Fred eventually graduated high school and attended the University of North Dakota, and later law school at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., class of 39. World War II then started, and Fred didn't take the route you might expect. His daughter said he chose to enlist in the Navy, even with his law degree, because he wanted to be with the regular guys, not the officers. He served on the USS Kennebec in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. After the war, the service would lead him to his soon-to-be wife, Catherine K. Boyle, an Army Air Corps nurse who served in India and Egypt during World War II. O'Keefe said, "My parents would meet at the 1947 National Catholic War Veterans Convention in Cleveland, Ohio. Each was there as a representative from their respective states, North Dakota and Michigan." O'Keefe said after many letters and visits to meet each other's families, they married on August 21st, 1948 in Detroit, where Kay wore a wedding dress worth noting. Her wedding dress was made from the silk of discarded parachutes she had sent home. Yes, discarded parachutes. O'Keefe said with a laugh, she never could see the sense in throwing away perfectly good material. The war loomed large for the young couple for years to come. Fred was an attorney for the Veterans Administration, and he and Kay were very active in local and national military organizations, including the Disabled American Veterans, Catholic War Veterans, and the Veterans of Foreign War. O'Keefe said, "I believe there's an article about my parents being the first married couple to have membership in the North Dakota VFW. The couple was also active in the Lions Club and the local Knights of Columbus. Fred was even the supreme warden of the Knights of Columbus in the early 1960s. O'Keefe recalls, "My dad was someone who would be on the road for weeks making sure veterans in rural North Dakota were receiving their VA benefits, and the next, he'd be in white tie and tails as master of ceremonies at a national banquet for the Knights of Columbus." She said his most cherished memories with the KCs included a tour of Paris, Rome, and Ireland, having a private audience with the Pope, and even a personal meeting with the President of Ireland. O'Keefe said that was something very impressive for his Irish in-laws at the time. And Kay Colby was keeping plenty busy on her own, working as a nurse at St. Ansgar Hospital in Moorhead and St. Luke's Hospital in Fargo, and also doing home health care. She was also appointed to the Fargo City Planning Commission. That was the group that actually helped develop the Civic Memorial Auditorium. Fred also worked with the Merchants Bank, and both Colbys were campaign workers for Herschel Lashkowitz, Byron Dorgan, Quentin Burdick, and several others. Fred died at the age of 81 in November of 1995. O'Keefe said with so much of his life devoted to veterans, it was appropriate that he was buried on November 11th, Veterans Day. Kay died at 82 on November 3rd, 2001. Both were remembered with love by their three children, Catherine or Kitty, Cecilia, and Fred. And while readers of the mailed toddler story might remember little Freddie Colby for that one odd day in 1915 when he arrived at Grandma's farm with a parcel post stamp stuck to his shirt, it's perhaps more appropriate to remember the life of service he and his wife later led. No doubt they were first-class people. And that is back then. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you join me again next time.
Get reliable and accurate local news with Inform.com. Inform.com is your trusted local news source with journalists dedicated to keeping you informed about what's happening in your community. Visit Inform.com now.